In order to achieve the goal of getting 60% of the African population vaccinated against COVID by 2022, China will provide 1 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines to African nations, including 600 million in the form of a donation.
China pledges more vaccines and economic help for Africa. Hello, I'm Einar Tangen, and this is The Heat. According to the World Health Organization, just over 7% of Africa's population is fully vaccinated against COVID-19. So President Xi Jinping's pledge of vaccines, medical and economic support to struggling African countries came as welcome news to leaders meeting in Senegal at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. CGTN's Mudimba has more in this report.
Today marked the final day of the FOCAC here in Dakar, Senegal, and the two-day forum saw Africa benefit so much from pledges and promises from Chinese President Xi Jinping. Just one of them is, of course, which is the key one, because Africa healthcare system is very fragile. That is giving Africa 1 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccine, which means Africa will really benefit and, of course, boost its fight against COVID-19 in the continent. Others are person-to-person relationship, which also means that cultural setup will also be taken care of. Trade ties between China and Africa grew up actually when it was a very difficult time for Africa as a continent during the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, so many things that President Xi Jinping touched on. Infrastructure, as usual, has been a very conspicuous picture between Africa and China, and this has played a very big role in cementing their relationship. President Xi Jinping came up with goodies like green lands for agriculture, exports, education, so much to actually offer Africa. And today, the last day of the forum, saw that President, that is Xi Jinping's promises, kept afloat by, that is Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who said that Africa is indeed a permanent and a very close friend to China. And this, no one can actually come in between. Of course, he cemented his statement by saying that indeed working together with Africa has actually boosted so much also in China. The win-win situation has actually been conspicuous, also upholding equity and justice. And of course, in terms of COVID-19 pandemic, this has been very instrumental in making sure that Africa fights the issue. Now, China also appreciates Africa for supporting President Xi's agenda in the continent. So from trade, security, innovation, technology, all touched on during the forum here in Dakar. Mudimba, CGTN, Dakar, Senegal.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Ambassador Robin Sanders served as the U.S. envoy to Nigeria and the Republic of Congo. She currently focuses on Africa's economic and business development as the head of the Feeds Advocacy Initiative. Sanusha Naidu is a senior research associate with the Institute for Global Dialogue. Also with us is Ken Gichinga. He's a chief economist with Mentoria Economics. And political and economic affairs commentator Einar Tangen joins us from Beijing. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Einar Tangen, this is the 8th China-Africa Forum. Africa Business Magazine says the close relationship between China and the African continent has been based on resource trade, but it's now shifting towards infrastructure and a political and strategic relationship. How does Africa fit in with China's broader geopolitical strategy?
Well, in two parts. One, China is relatively poor in terms of its resources. It ranks around bottom 100 countries in terms of resources per person. So for the foreseeable future, China will need resources. Africa has resources, but also China is looking for markets. So China is, obviously Africa with its growing population is a very important market for the future. They see the benefits of investing now in order to help the country, come of age. They need infrastructure, critical things. They need to have development, more trade, Belt and Road Initiative. Most of them are members. Downstreaming a lot of the kind of work, especially that which is labor intensive, to areas in Africa makes a lot of sense for both countries. For both areas.
Sanusha, of course, this is not a one-way street. African nations will be looking at their own national interests in this relationship. How important is China for their economic stability and growth?
Yeah, a good day, Anand, and fellow panelists. I think it's very important for us to contextualize the China-Africa engagement, or flip it around and say the Africa-China engagement. I mean, this is the 8th FOCAC meeting. It's last year was the 20th anniversary of the inception of FOCAC. And there are some key areas here where we have to be very clear in terms of the impact of this engagement. One of the areas that is very key for Africa's national interest, and particularly the continent's more continental interest, is the question of the level of trade. If you look at the trade statistics coming out, it's asymmetrical in terms of what was unveiled in the week before this FOCAC summit, FOCAC ministerial meeting that was happening. You saw that China exported more than imports, and more importantly, I think for Africa, the national interest is to change that kind of trajectory of the trade imbalance. There are few countries that from which China actually imports a lot more, and more importantly, when we talk about the infrastructure, I think we've also got to see that China is maturing in a little way in Africa around its investments, its trade. If you look at some of the points that President Xi Jinping made in his address to the Senegalese meeting, he kind of pointed out questions around the green economy, challenges around how trade is defined, opening up spaces with regard to not just about infrastructure and just in terms of resources, but also I think China is becoming a little bit more hesitant at times, cautious around some of the risk that underpins the financing of infrastructure in Africa as well. And so I think at the end of the day, that the opportunities here right now for African governments, African leaders, like we heard President Ramaphosa and others talk about, in actually recognizing the importance of the partnership, but also recognizing that there has to be mutual interest and mutual benefit. And I think this is where some of the challenges lie in terms of how do we actually promote African agency in the relationship.
Ken Gichinga, in his speech to the forum, the Chinese President Xi Jinping said China would pump $10 billion into African financial institutions for lending to small and medium-sized businesses, and another $10 billion would be pumped in to help stabilize foreign exchange reserves. China also said that it would write off interest-free loans that were due this year. All this, of course, designed to address the countries that were ravaged by the pandemic. What kind of impact do you think this would have?
Well, indeed, that was a breath of fresh air. If you really think about it, much of Chinese financing has been coming to large-scale infrastructure projects, which haven't always generated the cash flow that they had promised. So African governments have found themselves stuck with quite a bit of debt, much of it very hard to access as a member of the public. So this turnaround to financing businesses, particularly small businesses, which really are the lifeline of most African economies, I think should be a game changer if implemented as expected.
Right, and Ken, what do you make of the point raised by Sanusha a moment ago about there being more balance in the trade relationship?
Well, I think it's a valid point. For a long time, of course, Africa had been looking for a different perspective to global affairs. For the longest time, the global architecture really had been dominated by what we'd call the Anglo-Saxon tradition. So I think the entry of China into really global politics, I think, was welcome. And for a long time, the last 20 years, African governments have enjoyed financing for infrastructure projects. But I think what has happened right now is most of these countries are stuck in debt, and they've not really been able to resolve that by being able to export more to China, particularly on the agricultural produce, where there was an expectation that much of the agricultural produce, there'd be a significant increase. But you'd find that 3 countries in Africa really dominate export of agricultural produce to Africa. So it's still very imbalanced. Obviously, the import-export will make a big difference, but it's still a long way to go.
Ambassador Sanders, the United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal. That was about 2 weeks ago. He's promising more investment through the Build Back Better initiative. In fact, the South China Morning Post reported that Blinken's trip is being seen as a response to China's strong presence in Africa. But looking at, the continent as a whole and the United States' relationship with it, how big is it of a priority for the United States?
I think that one of the things that Secretary Blinken did on this trip was to underscore a U-turn that we're making in our relationship with the continent. In fact, he specifically said that the U.S. relationship is not linked to the relationship with China. He's making that a key point in our policy and the change he wants to make in that relationship. I think over the past years, and something that I've said at least since 2014, is that Africa is not the chessboard between the U.S. And China's geopolitics, but it should be a strategic partner. And I think that the trip that Secretary Blinken made was to underscore that, and he was very clear in that statement. He mentioned one element of his trip, but there were at least 4 pillars to that, in addition to sort of the Build Back Better aspect. On the business side, he talked about security, he talked about trade, he talked about cultural diplomacy, and he talked about a strategic engagement, which includes, thank goodness, a U.S.-Africa summit that we really haven't had here. We've had only one in 13 years. And so we do need to step up our game, and I think his trip to the region has done that, and now we have to deliver on the things that he said.
In fact, he did say on that trip, Ambassador, that the United States doesn't want to see the countries of Africa being junior partners in this, or having to make choices, having to choose between two sides, that, as you've pointed out, Africa should be seen more as a geopolitical partner. But how does that work in practical terms? How does it manifest itself?
I think it manifests itself with us kind of walking the walk and talking the talk. We've talked about our relationship with Africa over the last couple of years, but we haven't delivered, and we haven't made it strategic, and we haven't engaged regularly, and we haven't developed really a new way to work with the African continent. And that's what we have to do in just about every sector. I listened to President Xi and his 9 or 10 pillars, from green technology to training to investment to 1 billion doses of COVID in health systems and as well as in agriculture. But I'm not saying that we have to do the exact same things, but we need to do the same things that we do well on the continent. We haven't engaged in a way that expands on the health systems that we helped build during the HIV/AIDS crisis. We need to use that as a way to help Africa in the COVID crisis. We need to step up on trade and investment. We've talked about Prosper Africa, or at least the Secretary did on his trip, which is our development and investment program on the continent. So we have things in place. We haven't used them well. So this administration is not only using them, but expanding on what they will do. And we now have, of course, our top diplomat on Africa in place. And she's already been to the region. She went to about 6 more countries than the Secretary did, to really show that we are engaged. We're back. We know we haven't done well over the last couple of years, and we plan to do that.
Okay, we need to take a quick break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about China-Africa ties following the just concluded meeting in Senegal. Let's get back to our panel right now. And Einar Tangen, China, of course, has financed major infrastructure projects through the Belt and Road Initiative. This is what the Senegalese president, Macky Sall, said on the significance of those projects. Let's listen.
Dans le cadre des nouvelles routes de la soie,
within the framework of the new Silk Roads, the African Infrastructure Development Program and the Continental Free Trade Area, there is great potential for the Chinese-African partnership in terms of putting together infrastructure projects.
So, Einar, no doubt Africa needs these infrastructure projects, but there has been criticism that much of this has saddled these countries with unsustainable debt. In fact, the Republic of Congo right now is reviewing a $6 billion deal with Chinese investors. What do you make of that criticism? Is it valid?
Well, I mean, you have to start talking about the different governments that were involved. Remember, in a democracy, what you always do is criticize whatever was done before you. That's the basis of getting into power. So one government says we need this kind of infrastructure. This is where we want it. Remember, China doesn't come in and say, we want to build a road from here to there. What they do is they say, you know, you need infrastructure. You have a plan. What do you suggest? What do you want to do? So it's kind of 50-50. I think China is going to be a little bit more wary going forward in the future to make sure that these infrastructure projects are in fact sustainable and that there's a little bit more transparency. There has been issues out there. In terms of the amount of debt, yeah, it is substantial, but you know, it's a chicken and egg. If you don't have the infrastructure, you cannot develop. If you cannot develop, you can't answer your country's needs. I mean, you can't take this attitude that, you know, benign neglect will somehow make Africa great again. You know, we have a certain amount of criticisms coming from my colleagues. Sanusha said, oh, the balance of trade is not good. But the fact is, Africa would have to buy those things from somebody. So it's not a question of China somehow being predatory simply because they supply the goods that are wanted at a lower price. That actually decreases the cost for Africans. And in terms of the U.S., there's this issue about reliability. You know, the previous president, Trump, referred to African countries as, quote, S-holes. And I don't know that, you know, if he returns, that he won't take up the same idea. So at this juncture, China is the one who is acting. They're being very forceful in what they're doing. They think it is in the combined interest of everybody, including Africa. So at this juncture, that's their policy.
Sanusha, on that question of Chinese investors being more cautious right now, Beijing pledged $60 billion in 2015 and a similar amount 3 years later. But we have seen in recent years that Chinese investors are getting a little bit more cautious of the mounting debt that's been taken on by African countries. But where's the balance here?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the debt, it's very clear to disaggregate what debt we're talking about. If you're talking about interest-free loans, like you mentioned earlier, Alan, it's easy to write off those loans. But if it's market conditions linked loans, then it's a different ballgame. And I think on the trade issue as well, we've got to be very careful into assuming that Africa does have market access. I think in this kind of forum where President Xi Jinping announced market access into the Chinese economy is critical. But then I've seen this as well in 2006, in 2015, where market access is there. But the question is what products get market access into, whether it's China, whether it's the EU, or whether it's the US or any other market, because the more value addition you have in the product, the more the tariff escalation costs come in. The other challenge, I think, is not just for China, but I think for all political actors and external actors, as well as economic actors, whether you're talking about private sector or state bilateral engagements, is the challenge around understanding a changing African architecture. One of the things that's very critical in Africa right now is that civil society can really now start to pounce on what they feel are non-disclosure agreements in terms of engagement. And if you look at the Standard Gauge Railway project, which was a key project for China, you know, that got caught up in a legal wrangle between civil society actors who went to court in Kenya and asked the question of what was the contractual obligation, not necessarily challenging China per se, but challenging their own governments. And I think through those networks of understanding what kind of negotiations are happening, whether these contracts are being open and what kind of impact it's having as well, also changes the complexion. So the balance as well has to be not only from the Chinese side, but we're also saying from the African side. And I think the problem we're having here as well is when you look at some of the 9 points that President Xi Jinping outlined in his address to the ministerial meeting, he spoke about an industrial demonstration center, which is to tie in with the African free trade, continental free trade agreement, to overlap with the Belt and Road. He spoke about increasing, I think, agricultural impact and centers. We talked about training and capacity building, but on the peace and security, I felt it was a bit of a low key. Yeah. But all of these things also came through in 2006, which was really important in terms of the significant seminal difference in terms of the pivotal change in the China-Africa relationship. So I think what we are arguing as well, for me personally, and I don't talk on the rest of the talk for the rest of the continent, but for me personally, having tracked the China-Africa space from 2001, you have to ask yourself is how much of this is overlap and how much of this is going to be new. Obviously data, obviously the 1 billion vaccines that are coming in, 600 million being a donation and 400 million based on production, right, etc., is going to be key in all of this.
Right, Einar, very briefly, if you could please, I mean, what do you make of what you just heard? Is the nature of the relationship changing?
Yes, it is. Africa is going forward. There's 7 of the fastest growing economies in there. China would like to see that continue. Remember, China imports resources and exports value-added goods. Mm-hmm. But in order to, there are many that they won't be able to do. This is where the Belt and Road comes in. So yes, it has to be, as I said before, more transparent. There has to be a change in terms of how these governments are going about putting in the infrastructure. It has to be a little bit more guided and put together. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense from a feasibility point in terms of investment.
Ken Gichinga, where is the greatest potential for a change in the trade relationship? I mean, we talked earlier on about African exports to China. China said, President Xi, in fact, said that he would like to encourage more imports of African agricultural products and increase the number of zero-tariff goods. The goal is $300 billion of total imports over the next 3 years. And we know that China's running a surplus with the continent right now. So where's the potential here?
Well, I think the big potential is in capacity building. One of the products that Kenya exports to China, for example, is frozen avocado. And the difficulties that farmers have in being able to put that together, whether it's in the refrigeration, whether it's in the phytosanitary standards, that becomes a big challenge. And that's why I said at the very beginning of this interview, the ability to finance small businesses to be able to have that capacity to be able to do that, I think that was a game changer. I think broadly speaking in economics, there's a shift from fiscal policy, which is more on government investment in infrastructure, to monetary policy, which is being able to get access to credit to businesses that want to do business with China. I think that was a master stroke, and if they can move that direction, we'll have better capacity in terms of getting the equipment we need to meet the standards of the Chinese market.
And Ken, very briefly as well, what about sectors like digital innovation and the green economy as well?
Well, that has come up, and I think there is some potential there, particularly if you look at on the energy side. Countries like Kenya, for example, have made commitments to be green, 100% green by the year 2030. But I think more, if you just look at the big bulk of what you'd call the agriculture being the backbone of the Kenyan economy and most African economy, 60%, I still feel the opportunity is still very much within the agricultural space.
Ambassador Sanders, the recent concerns over the COVID variant, which was detected first in South Africa, has led some countries to impose travel restrictions on southern African countries. Here's the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, talking about that. Let's listen.
We need to resist unjustified as well as unscientific travel restrictions that only serve to further disadvantage developing economies. We have seen how some countries have started restricting travel to other countries, thus damaging their economies and particularly sectors of their economies that rely on the travel of people around the world.
So, Ambassador, does President Ramaphosa have a point there? I mean, are these travel restrictions hurting development in the countries of Africa?
I think it's a very difficult line to walk. I think that the world overall over the last 2 years, we've had ups and downs of whether or not travel restrictions help or don't help in terms of containing the spread of the virus. And so, you know, in listening to the head of the World Health Organization talk about the rapid spread of the potential for rapid spread of this new variant, I think it's hard to tell countries that they cannot put travel restrictions to give themselves time. I think the best response I've heard to this is that the idea for at least travel restrictions right now is to provide time to make sure that the vaccines that we have in place are effective, whether or not the booster on top of that further protects you. And right now, we don't have the answers to fundamental questions. So I understand the impact on the economy. I understand that it can be viewed in a negative manner, but I think there's no easy medium here. And so I think it should be measured and focused on very, very specifically so that when they can be changed and lifted, they are as quickly as possible. But I think until we have better answers to impact of this particular variant, where it is, the timeline I'm hearing here in the U.S. is that the scientists need about 2 more weeks to be able to answer all of those questions. And I do just want to make 1 or 2 comments quickly on the business side and trade side of this. I work in that space all the time. And I do think for Africa, the big focus should be on SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, no matter what sector they begin. That will help the trade imbalance. And I also think that trade finance for SMEs has got to be put in place. And that's where some of the weakness does lie.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Einar Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.